here. I guess most of you probably have volunteered for Whale Watch Week, Whale Watch Spoken Here, so you've probably seen a talk by Bruce May, our director. He basically pioneered the field of satellite tracking of large whales and developed the technology that I'm basically presenting the results of here. So. All right, so without further ado, just a quick outline of what I'll be talking about here. Just give a quick run through of some basic blue whale stats, although I expect most of you guys probably have heard some version of it before. Talk a little bit about the California current system, talk a little bit about our tagging methods, which you see going on here. That's me right there. Can everyone hear me in the back okay? A little more?
A little louder.
A little louder? Okay, sorry. And then I'll get down to the fun stuff, talking about the analysis of the satellite tracking data, looking at blue whale distribution, and then sort of talk a little bit about what it all means at the end. So just for starters, some blue whale facts. They're the largest animal ever to have lived, even bigger than any of the dinosaurs. You can see on the right here, this is Bruce's wife, Mary Lou. She's standing in the middle of two jawbones from a blue whale. So that's not even the size of the entire head of the blue whale right there that she's standing in. So that just gives you a good sense of the overall scale of the size of these things. They're typically about 75 to 85 feet long, can weigh up to 150, 170 plus tons. So these are massive animals. And of course, why wouldn't the largest animal around be one of the smallest types of prey around? So these little krill here, they're about 2 to 4 millimeters in length or so, but they form dense schools which can let these blue whales eat up to 4 tons of these krill a day. And they need to eat that kind of quantity in order to maintain their massive size. So whaling, you guys have probably known whaling reduced the global population of just about all the whales out there. Blue whales were reduced globally down to less than 5% of their pre-whaling population. And really that's probably a generous number. The best guess down in Antarctica was there was about 250,000 blue whales before whaling, and now there's somewhere around 1,000 or so. So that's down to less than 1% of the original population. It just so happens that one of the largest remaining populations of blue whales is right here off the U.S. west coast. There's about to be about 2,500 individuals in that population. They migrate up here in the summertime from their breeding areas down off of Mexico and Central America. And they arrive in mid to late June, early July to feed in the highly productive California current waters along the U.S. west coast. So I think most of you guys are local around here, right? So you've probably at least heard a little bit about upwelling and whatnot. So I'll run through it real quick here. But you all know when you walk out on the beach in the summertime in the afternoon, you're probably going to get sandblasted because the wind just howls out of the north, right? Well, water is transported actually 90 degrees to the right of the direction that the wind is blowing. It's got to do with the Coriolis effect, the way the Earth spins. But so basically, when the wind is blowing from the north, this is actually looking south, unfortunately. But, so when the wind is blowing in this direction, the water actually moves offshore, 90 degrees to the right of the wind direction. And so then cold, nutrient-rich water from down deep is sucked up to the surface to replace that water that got migrated offshore. And you can see that in this image here. The arrows are the wind field, predominant wind field during the summertime, and then these lighter blues and purples. This is a sea surface temperature map right here. So this shows you've got the cold water that's been advected up to the surface along the coast here. And so that's all really nutrient-rich water that forms the basis for the food chain in the summertime, which can develop enough prey density for these blue whales to feed on. So, you'd think these blue whales, they're these huge critters out there, they must be easy to study, must know a lot about them. And we do know generally quite a bit about their range and what they do, but not as much as you would think. Given that they spend 95+% of their time below the surface, the timing of their arrival and departure in these areas, and then what are the possible implications of the answers to those kind of questions. So we have been putting out satellite tags since 1993 on blue whales. We put out 173 of them from 1993 to 2008 in order to try and answer some of these questions. And we used a variety of tags. The technology evolved during those 15 years, but most of the tags were implantable satellite tags that were deployed using either a crossbow or an air-powered applicator. And we typically have to get within 2 to 4 meters of these whales to put these tags on, so the folks in the front row here are well outside of range. But you can see this is actually a photo from one of our approaches here in the blue whale. We get right up alongside of it. And the reason for that is we need to put the tags as high up on the back as possible to get a good antenna orientation so the signal can get to the satellite, and also so that the tag can come out of the water when the whale comes up to breathe, because the tags can't transmit through the water. So we deployed 173 of these tags, typically from late July to early October, depending on the year. The majority of the tags were deployed around the Channel Islands or the Gulf of the Farallones. A few of them were up near Cape Mendocino, and maybe a few at Monterey Bay. And tags provide Argus quality locations. So I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on the statistics behind all this kind of stuff. So suffice to say that the tags typically will give you locations that are accurate to 1 kilometer to anywhere up to about 10 kilometers of air. And you might think, well, 10 kilometers, that's pretty poor quality location. But when you've got these whales, they can travel up to 100 miles in a day if they want to. So when you consider that, 1 kilometer to 10 kilometers error at worst really isn't all that bad. So we did some extra little fancy hoorah stats that I'm not going to get into. And then we basically just isolated the satellite locations that occurred within the U.S. exclusive economic zone, so just within the waters within 200 miles of the coast. And so this is just an example of what we get here. A whole bunch of each of these dots represents a location that we got from the tag. The lines connecting it just connected chronologically. We don't necessarily know that that's the path that the whale took. And then the question becomes, how do you say something meaningful about, convert these locations into something meaningful that tells you where the whales spent their time, how they use an area. And so to do that, we use what's called created a kernel home range analysis. Basically, it creates a surface that describes the variable intensity of species. Simple way of putting it is basically creates a shape that encompasses all of the locations, the area that all of the locations cover. And then you can slice portions of that area. So the 90% contour is the smallest area that contains 90% probability of use based on all of the blue whale locations. So this is basically this area in yellow. You can think of it as sort of the overall range of that tagged whale. And then the 50% contour is called the core area of use. And that's the smallest area containing 50% probability of use based on the locations. So that's basically sort of the most important area, the area where the whale spent the most of its time. That's represented by these little smaller blue areas here. And if we flip back up to the track, you can see that down here there's a whole bunch of these locations, and there's one of those core areas. There's another cluster of locations up here. There's another one of those core areas. So it's a way of identifying, the most heavily used portions of the area that the whale traveled through. Okay, so on to the fun stuff here. So we had 53 tracks out of all the tags that we deployed that had enough locations in the USEEZ that we could do this home range analysis on them. And so we then overlaid all the home ranges on top of each other and shaded them to represent the number of home ranges that overlapped at each area. And so basically, and that tells you, basically the amount of use or the number of whales that use each area. So the darker shading here represents areas that were used by more whales. And there's the legend up here, the maximum of 29 to 40 whales. So what we saw was that the whales typically were most concentrated, or the highest use areas were along the continental slope from the Southern California and up to Northern California. Up to Northern California, sort of near Cape Mendocino, and on up even into Oregon, in some cases all the way up into Washington. And of course, I think the last few years we've actually had some blue whales right here off of Depot Bay, about 5 or 10 miles. Of course, that couldn't have happened when we were tagging these guys. Way down in California to find them, but what are you going to do? So the areas of highest concentration within this area we see are there at the Channel Islands and up at the Gulf of the Farallones. And those areas are traditionally very productive, high upwelling summer productivity areas. So you'd expect that there's going to be a whole lot of prey concentration in those areas for the whales to feed on. Now, when we look at the core areas, these are the areas that sort of were most heavily used by the whales. You can see again the same main areas of concentration are highlighted. There at the Channel Islands and up at the Gulf of the Farallones. But the overall amount of overlap between the core areas is much lower than we saw with the home ranges. So if you look up here, you can see there's a lot, the darker shading covers a whole lot more area than it does with the core areas. And so that suggests that the whales always will return to this same general range area that's described by the home range, but within that area they'll focus on smaller regions that may be different from year to year or month to month, depending on where the prey happens to be at the time. So, the other thing to notice is that most of the distribution is more of a north-south orientation than east to west. They're along the coast. So that lets us look at this probably horrible graph to you, but it's actually not that complicated, I swear. This shows the latitude of the satellite locations on the left axis here, and then we've got weeks of the year on the bottom. So basically what this shows is the number, or the latitude of each location, it's the latitude of the locations for every location per week that we got throughout the year. And, we need to move a little bit, sorry. So basically, what we see here is, so the boxes are what you want to pay attention to. The boxes outline three-quarters of the locations fit into that area, and the red lines are the average latitude for that week, and then the little whiskers show the extent of the data range. So you want to pay attention to where the boxes are. Basically, starting in August, they're typically sort of in the Southern California range. 34 degrees latitude is sort of Santa Barbara, Channel Islands area. Then as you get later into the fall, they sort of start shifting northwards and moving on up to about sort of Northern California, 38 degrees latitude. And the interesting thing about that is that the spring bloom, the timing of the spring upwelling bloom actually works its way north also, and it seems to follow the same sort of timing. Basically, down to Southern California, there's sort of continuous moderate amount of upwelling generating some productivity down there. And then later in the summer, as the upwelling will work its way north, and start generating more productivity as it works its way north. So, okay, and prey concentrations have been shown, or prey concentrations large enough for blue whales to feed on have been shown to lag this increase in upwelling by the spring bloom by 1 to 4 months. So upwelling happens, it generates some cold nutrient-rich water, and that starts the food chain. It takes a month to 4 months for enough krill to find that area of nutrients and reproduce and generate enough density for the blue whales to come in and be able to feed. So the spring bloom, or the upwelling, reaches its peak in Southern California around June, late June, and in Northern California around August. So what we see then is whales reaching, coming into Southern California in June, and then a couple months later, they're working their way north. So the time lags actually work out, where if the peak of the upwelling in Northern California starts in August, then by October, there's going to have been enough prey generated that blue whales can go and forage there. And that's actually what we're seeing here. Basically, it looks like the whales arrive into Southern California June, early July-ish, and they stay there and feed on that early season productivity that's generated. And then as the fall goes on, they move northwards to start feeding on more of the prey that's been generated by the later upwelling as the spring bloom moves north. So the bottom portion of this plot here shows the number of locations that we received, or number of blue whale locations that we received in each month, or each week, sorry. And you can see this little rise here. That's actually because that's where we were typically deploying the tags. So we were typically deploying the tags late July, early August, so that's why there's a pretty sharp increase in locations right there. But the descent over here in October, that's the result of the whales leaving and going south on their migration. So the southward migration typically started around mid-October, although some whales stuck around into December, and we even had one that stayed around all the way into January 7th. So that was a real late departure. Okay, so zooming in, looking at things a little more fine scale here, we saw some interesting variability in the home range sizes between individual whales within the same year. So this is an example. We have 3 home ranges, 2 small ones, yellow one down here, pink one up here, and then this much larger, it's 36 times larger than one in blue. And the interesting thing to notice is that this blue one encompasses or includes both of these smaller home ranges and other areas. So the reason that blue whales are here off the U.S. West Coast is because they're looking for places to forage, to feed. And so you would think if these areas with the small home ranges, if they were good enough, if there was enough prey there, you would think that this whale with the big home range would have stopped when it passed by that area and fed there. So that suggests that basically there may be 2 different foraging strategies going on here depending on the whale. You might have these littler home ranges might represent whales that find a marginally okay concentration of prey and just stay there and work it. It might not be the best, but maybe you won't be able to find anything better, so they just stay there and work that one patch. Whereas the larger home range might represent a whale that finds a marginal sized patch and says, maybe there's something better out there, and goes exploring for something more. If you want to anthropomorphize it a little bit, you could say it might be 2 different, risk strategies. Or one is risk averse and one is willing to take a risk to hopefully find better food. Okay, so another interesting thing to come about from this study was we had one tag that actually lasted for 507 days. That's by far a record duration for blue whale tags. That's actually the second longest tag we've ever had go on any of our species of whales. And the really neat thing about this was that it allows us to compare the movements of the same individual for the same time period in consecutive years. So we basically can see if this whale does the same thing, goes to the same places, in consecutive years. So here we have in blue, the blue dots are the locations from 2004 from this whale, and then the yellow dots are the locations from 2005 for this whale during the summertime. And then we actually took the locations from the time period, or from the same time period in both years. I think it ended up being August 7th through November 15th or somewhere around there, about 3 months or so. And we made home range areas of just those locations to look at how well those areas matched up, if they were the same, if they were very different, to look at the site fidelity that this whale might have shown. And it turned out that it showed a very strong site fidelity. So there was a 66% overlap of the home range in 2005 to the home range from 2004. If you exclude all these littler areas, there's a few little patches down here, and just look at this bigger area up here, there was an 88% overlap of the two areas from one year to the next year. On top of that, the whale arrived at Cape Mendocino, where those up here, within 1 week, or 1 week later in 2005 than 2004. And it departed only 1 week earlier in 2005 for its migration than in 2004. So basically, this whale was doing almost the exact same thing at the exact same time, going to the exact same place in 2 consecutive years. And that's something that we really haven't ever been able to see before in any species of whales. Okay, so what's all this mean? Take you back to the core area map here, showing the most important areas to these whales, or the areas that were most highly used by these whales. And you see that 2 of them, down here in the Channel Islands and the Gulf of the Farallones, they're near population centers. You've got San Francisco up here, and then you've got the whole LA, San Diego, everything that's down there in Southern California. So that raises the issue for potential interactions with humans. In fact, when we zoom in on the Channel Islands area, this is the same core area map that I just showed you, but it's just zoomed in on the Channel Islands here. This is Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa. You can see that this hatched line right here, this is the commercial shipping lane. This is where those big 800-foot long freighters that are moving at 20, 30 knots are passing through. And it basically goes right through the area of highest blue whale concentration. So that's raising the possibility of not only impacting the whales from increased vessel noise, that kind of thing, but actually with collisions between the whales and these fast-moving, huge ships. And that's actually, in fact, what we saw, where in 2008, at least 3 blue whales washed ashore in that area that had been hit by ships. And, so honestly, we don't want to see blue whales getting hit by these freighters, but the shipping companies actually don't want to either. It's actually in their interest to not hit these whales because, the whales are big. I mentioned earlier, they're 150, 170 tons. Even if it's a big ship, it's got the potential to do some damage to that boat. And if it does, then they have to haul the boat out of the water, they have to inspect it, they have to do all this stuff that's costing the company time and money. So they're also looking for ways to avoid hitting these whales, or looking for areas where there's the possibility that they might. So based on our data here, one possible solution we could suggest would be to just move the commercial shipping lanes south of the island down here, and that would avoid the highest use area, or the area that was most used by these tagged blue whales. And if need be, you could also only move it from, say, July until October, which was the highest period of time when the most whales were in that area. Also, looking up at the Gulf of the Farallones here, we see a similar type situation where we've got the shipping lane. In this case, it forks, it branches into 3 directions, but it goes right through the area of highest concentration there by the Gulf of the Farallones. So in this case, a possible solution would be to extend the shipping lane out so that it comes straight out here past the 2,000 meter isobath before then splitting off to whatever way it's going to go. That way, at least, you're minimizing time where you're passing through a high concentration area and therefore minimizing the risk of encountering whales while you're doing that. So obviously, it's never that easy. You can't just say, oh, sure, we'll just move the shipping lane, no problem. There's numerous interest groups that need to be consulted on this. There's NOAA, there's the Navy. The Navy has training ranges down in Southern California. The shipping companies, they want to do this, but they also don't want to do anything that's going to cost them money. And so they're going to want to, check it out from every angle. So, the goal of this data and presentation isn't, to say this is exactly what needs to be done. It's basically to inform the discussion that these groups need to have and to provide information on the distribution and the high use areas of where these blue whales tend to be, and also the seasonality of their occurrence, so that these groups, when they get together and talk about the possibility of moving a shipping lane or doing something that they can reduce the likelihood of hitting a whale with these ships, they can have, be as well informed as possible about what these blue whales are doing. So just to summarize, I showed you that blue whales generally use the productive upwelling areas along the continental slope from Southern California on up to Northern California. They tended to shift towards the north later in the fall, and that sort of followed the timing of the prey that was generated by the seasonal upwelling bloom. There's some different individuals had different home range sizes, which might indicate that the different individuals use different strategies when they're looking for food. And then we saw a very high site fidelity from one whale that tag lasted for a long time and visited the same places in consecutive years at the same time of year and departed at the same time of year. And then also, showed you that the main areas where these blue whales tended to hang out was, intersected by commercial shipping lanes, which raises the possibility of anthropogenic impacts from either noise or vessel collisions, and how this kind of information can be used to inform managers while they try and figure out what to do about that kind of thing. So with that, I think I've talked at you long enough. Any questions?
Can you make any inferences about the blue whales on our coast? You were saying June or July, but that would be furthest south of Birding.
Yeah, up here,
whales.
I don't know exactly, but I would think it would be more like September-ish, August, September, and it's also going to depend on how early the upwelling.
So later
in the season. Yeah, they first come into sort of Southern California area, and that's actually, I'm not sure how well it shows it here. This is sort of does. So this one, the track in 2005. This is all of the 2005 locations from this whale. And it basically, in April, it came up here to the Channel Islands, went back down and stayed near Ensenada. Came back up here again, stayed for a while, went up to the Gulf of the Farallones and back a few different times, and then went up to the Farallones, and then went up to the Cape Mendocino area. And I think that that's, more or less a model of what happens for at least some of these whales, is that, it basically looks like it sort of came up to check out the Channel Islands area, may or may not have been good enough, went back south. came up again, decided to stay, and then sort of periodically was checking further north, and then eventually went up there, and then eventually continued on up to the Cape Mendocino area.
So that's really far south from here, like 4 or 5
Yeah.
miles. So you're assuming that some of these whales went go ahead.
Yeah, and actually some of the ones that we tracked did go up there. So this is the core area of that, where the area the smallest, where we spent the most time. And we've got, this is Cape Blanco right here. So here's one that spent a bunch of time right there, just Cape Arago, that area. One was up here near all the way up past Westport in Washington. But it does sort of seem like the last blue whales that we tagged was in 2008, and to that point, I don't really remember hearing about very many blue whales here off of Oregon. It seems like just in the last sort of 3-4 years or so, we've had a couple of years where they've been here and been in close. I think blue whales have typically come up here, but they've been 20-30 miles offshore and maybe more down near Cape Blanco. So yeah, I think these are either, it looks like they're sort of extending their range to the north. We're actually starting to see them more up at Vancouver Island and even up off of southeast Alaska into the Gulf of Alaska, and which was in their historic range. So it could be that this is just sort of a natural range extension, and maybe it's food competition, maybe it's just explorers checking out the unknown. That's sort of still to be determined. Yeah.
Is there any estimate on whether or not the population is increasing, decreasing, or staying the same?
Well, it all depends on who you ask and which study you're looking at. Short answer is it's at least staying the same. Some of the studies have shown that it's increasing, some have not. I think the best guess, I think if you look at the IWC webpage where they list the different stocks of blue whales and stuff, they say that it's not increasing. But there is disagreement, and it's part of it has to do with how hard it is to sample the population. You've got these huge whales, they're moving over a huge area, they're spending most of their time underwater, and you have to somehow count them.
Yeah.
So, you're going to get really variable results depending on where you go, how long you spend out there, and what the weather was like. When the wind's blowing and there's all sorts of whitecaps out there, there could be tons of whales out there and you won't see anything. So, yeah, best current guess is not expanding, but it may be expanding, but we just can't quite tell with our current level of surveys.
Well, then how do they come up with the number 2,500? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no, that's sort of the this study says this study says that, and they kind of settle in on one number. There's ship-based surveys where they go out and do these huge grids out there in the middle of the ocean, and then there's what's called mark recapture surveys where you go out and you take pictures of individuals, and then you go out a whole bunch of times and you see how many times you see the same individual on different occasions, and then you can sort of calculate how many people, how many possibilities there are in the population based on the number of times you recite the same individual. So it's, different methods, they give different numbers and different error ranges, and so the 2,500 number is, just kind of that, maybe it's a little of this, maybe it's a little of that, this is kind of in the middle. Anyone else? Yeah.
Does the polar ice melt affect the upwelling? Does it have an effect on it the more when you add water? I mean, is that something you can anticipate, or is it already doing it?
I mean, down here, so first off, give the caveat that the wind is what generates the upwelling down here. So the melting of the ice and that kind of stuff could and probably will affect the dominant weather patterns in some way. And so if that somehow caused there to be less wind in the summertime, that would have a huge effect on the upwelling here. I don't know that the freshwater input or something of the melting ice up in Alaska will have a noticeable effect down here. Up there, it probably will. At least in Antarctica, they're really actually sort of, it's wondering how it's going to work out because the ice extends so far out into the ocean that it's basically a refuge for any non-air breathing critters. So there's massive, massive swarms of krill that are a kilometer or so back underneath the ice where the whales can't get at. And so it's basically a hugely productive area because all these air-breathing animals are sort of diving in under the ice and getting at the edge of this massive swarms of krill and other kind of productivity, but they can't get it all. But as that ice retreats, there's going to be, eventually they're going to butt up against the continent of Antarctica. There's going to be less room for them to actually stay out of the range of the air-breathing predators, and so then that might, throw the whole system out of whack. I don't know that there's that kind of a system up in Alaska with this, like in the in the Arctic, with the sea ice up there. I'm sure there is somewhat, but I don't know exactly how it works.
Thank
you. Good.
Their main source of food is the krill.
Yep.
And is the krill something that can reproduce only close to the shore? Or how many miles out can they reproduce?
Well, there's different species, and so they can, reproduce different rates. The main limiting factor, though, is the amount of nutrients that are available for the krill to use. So, the krill will be able to reproduce, there could be 5 of them, there could be 100 of them, but the whales need there to be billions of them in a very, very small area so that they can come through and take a big gulp and get a huge mouthful of krill. So that's going to be, I don't think we necessarily have to worry about the krill populations sort of dying out. We just have to worry about them not being so concentrated that the whales can actually forage on them efficiently. There are 2 main species of krill that the whale will feed on. One of them is sort of a nearer shore. I think it's usually in less than 1,000 meters of water, less than 100 meters of water. And the other one is sort of a further offshore, out to about 500 meters of water. And those are the 2 main krill species that the blue whales will feed on. But yeah, it's not so much where they're capable of reproducing, it's how well they can reproduce based on the amount of nutrients they have available. Yeah.
What about the human activities on the krill population? I understand Japan and several countries are going down to the Antarctic and they're harvesting large amounts of krill.
Yeah, omega-3 oil or something.
Yeah.
And even for farmed fish, for fish meal, they put krill in that and a few other things. That's, I guess we'll see. It all depends on how much they're taking out. I mean, that is the one thing is, these whales are hugely efficient predators, so they remove, each whale removes tons of krill per day from the ocean. So, if the fisheries are only taking a ton or 2 tons of krill, maybe it's not that big of a deal.
I would say that they predate whales by orders of magnitude.
Yeah, I would assume so too. I was trying to be generous, but basically it's more competition. There's going to be a finite amount of krill, and someone's going to get it. And if that's us, then the whales aren't going to get it. That's just kind of what happens when you fish your way down the food chain. You start catching the smaller forage fish and the krill and that kind of thing, and then all of a sudden, none of the bigger fish, the bigger animals, have as much to eat, and so you're going to start seeing those stocks decline also. And because that's the other thing is at least everything needs krill. Krill is the basis of the food chain. Birds, fish, sea lions, whales, everything needs krill. And if they don't eat krill, they eat something that eats krill. So, yeah. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thanks.